Imagine that in 1941, you were a soldier of the Red Army, and you have been taken prisoner by the Germans. For all the following years, your only hope is for Germany to lose the war, so that you can be rescued and return home, where your great sacrifice is recognized. But what really happened to these men? During the first months of 1945, the Red Army assaulted the last German defenses on the Eastern Front, finally reaching Berlin on April 20th. Throughout this entire process, the Soviets were freeing millions of Russian prisoners, who had been captured by the Germans during their 1941 and 1942 attacks. It is estimated that during these first campaigns, the Germans captured some 5.5 million prisoners, who were later used for forced labor in defensive constructions, in the fields, or in the war industry. In addition, there was another, smaller group that decided to join the Germans and fight within the Wehrmacht. In any case, when the war came to an end, it is estimated that only 2 million of them were left alive, and they were the ones who were rescued by the Red Army. However, and although it seemed that everything was over for them, and they would be treated as heroes in their country, the worst was yet to come. On May 11, 1945, a few days after the end of the war, Stalin gave the order to establish concentration camps to detain his former soldiers who had been captured, and who were now being rescued. Thus, some 100 concentration camps were created, each with a capacity to house 10,000 former soldiers. These released prisoners were to be interrogated by the NKVD, without any mercy, let alone recognition for their services rendered in the early part of the war. The main objective of these interrogations was to establish the reason why each one of them had been captured, and to detect possible traitors or deserters. On the other hand, it was also intended to see what influences they had during their life outside the Soviet Union, and with what mentality they were going to return. These interrogations lasted until the end of 1946, for almost a year and a half. These actions were carried out both with the 2 million Soviet soldiers, and with the other 3 million civilians who had also been sent from the East, to work in Germany. Thus, it is estimated that of these 5 million people between civilians and the military, more than 1.5 million were sent to the gulags in Siberia, or to forced labor battalions elsewhere. In any case, whether or not they went into captivity in the Soviet Union itself, or were released, they were all branded as potential enemies of the state. The penalty for that 1.5 million who were sent to a gulag was 25 years in prison. As we can imagine, enduring this situation was very hard for most of them, who could not understand why they were treated so badly when they returned to their homeland for which they had fought. What was my fault when my company ran out of ammunition? Many of them wondered. Another of them commented the following: "The experience was even worse than the one we lived in the German enclosures, since we had no idea what was going to happen to us. They had made us prisoners of the country whose liberation we had fought for, and treated us as traitors. They broke our spirits. But, what was this due to? What was the real reason for this treatment of former Soviet soldiers? Well then, let's see it. It all started after the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, this being the moment when a new government was installed in Russia. One of its characteristics was that they refused to sign the provisions of the Hague Conventions, which affected the treatment of prisoners of war. Thus, and to summarize, the Soviet government did not commit itself to anything with respect to the treatment given to prisoners of war. This was a controversial issue at the international level, and finally Molotov had to publish the signature of a special document in which they promised to respect the prisoners of war. However, Stalin refused any such recognition, and it was only an outward-facing measure. When the German invasion began in June 1941, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers began to be captured during the first weeks of the conflict. This led Stalin to adopt a very radical measure, which in the future would affect millions of his own soldiers. This new regulation read as follows: "The capture is an act of treason against the homeland. There is no more despicable or treasonous act. The greatest punishment imaginable awaits the traitor in his homeland, for he will be shot as soon as we win the war. With this, Stalin wanted to make it clear to his soldiers that they had to fear him more than the German invader. So, every soldier had to be clear that if he surrendered for whatever reason, that would be his death sentence, so he had better fight until the end even if he didn't have ammunition. What was really being encouraged was that the groups of soldiers that were left isolated tried to break the German line to communicate with the Red Army again, or that they continued fighting in the German rear as partisans. Thus, the Soviet Union was the only country of all in which the capture of its soldiers was for them an act of treason, on the same level as fleeing to an enemy country or desertion. However, and despite how hard it may seem to us, this measure was gradually extended, and it did not only affect the soldiers. Because the German advance was unstoppable during the first weeks of combat, and the capture of Soviet prisoners of war was increasing, in mid-July 1941 punishments were also added for the relatives of soldiers who allowed themselves to be captured. In summary, this decree established that there was collective guilt in the soldiers' capture, which the family also had to share. In this way, the destruction of the families of the captured soldiers was established. The message that was given to the soldiers was that those who preferred to surrender before continuing to fight would be annihilated, and their families would be deprived of the means necessary for their existence. This would be done through the confiscation of their assets and their deportation to labor camps. However, and as common sense dictates, this measure was applied in very few cases, since if it had been carried out exactly, it would have meant the self-destruction of the Soviet Union. Thus, and as we have indicated previously, this decree was intended to send a clear message to the soldiers, in which the only alternative they had was to fight to the death, regardless of the circumstances. On the other hand, and although this measure is very ruthless, it must be said that Stalin complied with that of his own son, and did not give him any benevolent treatment when he was captured. When he was informed that his son had been taken prisoner on July 16, 1941, Stalin said that he no longer had any children, and immediately ordered the arrest of his son's wife because she shared part of the guilt. Thus, it cannot be said that he did not set an example with the members of his own family. Finally, this decree prevented any kind of prisoner exchange with the Germans from taking place, so they were all rejected, including the one the Germans offered them for Stalin's son. Finally, and before concluding the program, we have to indicate that although much has been said about the abuses committed by the Soviets with German women when they entered the borders of the Third Reich, they also took the same attitude towards the Soviet women themselves who they had been captured by the Germans. Thus, and to summarize, we have to say that when a Soviet citizen was taken prisoner by the Germans, he lost all kinds of rights, and was treated as an enemy of the state. Well, what did you think of this event? Do you understand why the Soviets treated their own prisoners so badly when they rescued them in 1945? If you want to see the fate of those Russians who decided to enlist in the German army, I leave you in the description the interview we have on this subject with Carlos Caballero Jurado. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you as always every Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.